All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Right, so I'm Pieter Gagnon, senior researcher here at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I work with a group of folks here who use a variety of different tools and models to study both the current and possible future of the US electric grid, as well as many other questions. I am here to talk to you specifically today about the Cambium datasets, which are annually updated, publicly available data products, which contain data about the possible future of the US electric grid and is designed to help other people conduct forward-looking analyses that involve the electric sector in some way. So, context, take a step back. Why are we here? What are we trying to solve with this Cambium dataset? So many people, hopefully many of you in the audience are interested in performing forward-looking analyses of decisions that either impact the electric grid or are impacted by the electric grid. Anytime you're selling or purchasing electricity or perturbing things in any way with the electric grid, that's kind of the domain that we're playing in here. However, there's a difficulty if that is your objective, which is that the grid is changing quite rapidly. So if you're trying to do a forward-looking analysis, what do you do? For example, this is just one metric. There's many different things that are changing, but what I have here is a plot that is showing the greenhouse, the CO2 emissions intensity of the US electric grid, just national level CO2 intensity. In the orange here, you can see we have historical data reported from the government eGrid data source. And then in the green, we have NREL's projections of the CO2 emissions intensity of the bulk power sector. So the key here, of course, is that if you, for example, one of the questions you could be trying to investigate is if you're trying to understand the potential emissions impact of electrifying a vehicle fleet, or if you're designing a grid-aware building, you're probably not just interested in the way things are today, but you're probably also interested in the way that things are going to be changing over the lifetime of this asset or analysis that you're doing. Here we can say if you're interested in greenhouse gas emissions of the US electric grid, we see historically that there has been fairly rapid change, and that's projected to both accelerate in the near term as well as just in general continue looking forward in the coming decades. So again, if you're trying to do these forward-looking analyses, just looking right here might not be enough, which is kind of the point of Cambium, is to look ahead. I'm just showing this greenhouse gas emissions metric right now to kind of help illustrate the idea of change. But of course, it's not just this metric. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the diurnal and seasonal patterns are changing. There's changes in the cost of electricity and the patterns of the cost of electricity. All these types of, there's many different things that are evolving. So depending on what you're trying to ask, what question you're trying to investigate, it may be changing underneath you. So if you're trying to do something like understand the value of different flexible technology, like different types of energy storage in a highly renewable future grid, that's a type of question that we're trying to answer. If you're just interested in understanding better what the projected generation mixture might look like in different parts of the country in the future, all these types of things are the types of data that we are trying to provide through this Cambium data set. So getting a little bit more deep, that's why we built Cambium, is to help with this if you're doing forward-looking analyses, to be able to look forward and kind of anticipate or respect the projected evolution of the US electric grid. As I mentioned in the intro, the Cambium datasets are annually updated. We're coming up on our 5th release late this calendar year. And then we will continue to update and release things just as we continue to march forward in time. Technology, cost, and performance change, and projections change, policies change, all this kind of stuff. So we continue to update and re-release these annually. The data sets contain data projecting possible futures of the grid from now to 2050 across a handful of different futures. So I'm going to show you some figures here just to kind of get a feeling for what futures we are projecting. we project multiple futures because the future is uncertain. So in the most recent data set, and it would tend to be like this, sometimes we drop or add a scenario, but in our most recent data set, there were 6 business as usual style scenarios, as well as 2 scenarios where we impose decarbonization onto the electric grid. So first, just to show the business as usual cases, I'm not going to get super into these. You can go and look up there's a report that talks more about them, both the assumptions that go into them, but also you can of course download the data and play with this in much more detail. I'm just going to give you kind of a high level taste of what these different scenarios are. So like I said, 6 business as usual style cases. So we have our mid case. That's what we mean by that is we're drawing from central projections for things like future fuel costs, technology costs and performance, those sorts of things, legislation as it's currently enacted at both the state and federal level, all that kind of stuff. So that's really our most classic business as usual style central case. But then we also have different perturbations because again, key things are uncertain. So for example, we have both advanced and conservative renewable energy and battery cost scenarios. So basically what is the projection of the evolution of the US electric grid if renewables and batteries are cheaper and perform slightly better, or more expensive and perform slightly worse over the coming decades. We also have what we call a high demand growth scenario. I will say that our central projection already has a decent amount of demand growth relative to the past decade, just because of what is projected on the demand side, as well as demand side incentives and the Inflation Reduction Act, things like that. But we have a scenario that has even higher demand growth, significant demand growth, representing significant electrification. And then we have a high natural gas price and low natural gas price scenario. So all that's to say, if you look at these plots, which are the generation mixtures by technology for these 6 different scenarios, you can kind of get a feeling in the beginning here. They all start in the same place with the grid as it is today, where we have nuclear, coal, gas, a handful of contribution from hydro, Canadian imports, geothermal, biopower, and then a chunk of wind here in blue and solar in yellow. And then they take different paths looking forward, but they all see significant wind and solar growth. Gas sticks around and tends to grow. It certainly grows in capacity. The energy contribution depends on the scenario. Coal tends to decline rapidly over the remainder of the decade. And then nukes tend to stick around with some retirements near the end of the projection. So high level, the story across these multiple futures, high level is fairly robust story. However, the details do matter quite a bit, and there's varying levels of each of these different technologies in these scenarios that we're projecting. And then, like I said, these are the 6 business as usual style projections, but then we also have 2 scenarios where we impose decarbonization trajectories onto the US electric grid. So the model is basically telling us what is the least cost solution if you were to try to do one of 2 things, one of them being 95% decarbonization by 2050, net decarbonization, and then another one, a much more aggressive one, which is 100% net decarbonization by 2035. So you can see that there's 2 different projections here where we've imposed those constraints onto the model and had it tell us the pathway to achieving those constraints. So those are the scenarios that are in this Cambium data set. As I've been mentioning, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the metrics are, these are just the high level results that I'm showing you, kind of the national generation mixtures to get a feeling what's there. But there's a lot more data that is available within the Cambium data sets that is designed to support other analyses. I'll have more details on that in a slide or 2. Before I do that, I did want to say I've been talking about projections a lot. I just want to say what I mean by that. So the primary model, the workhorse model underneath the Cambium data sets is NREL's REEDS model. REEDS is a capacity expansion model that projects the evolution of the US electric grid by solving for the least cost, considering both build and operational decisions, subject to reliability, operational, and policy constraints. So whenever we're looking at these figures here, and whenever I say projection, what I mean is that it's the least cost solution subject to those constraints. It has to be a reliable grid. It has to meet things like renewable portfolio standards, as well as respecting various types of operational constraints. But other than that, it's least cost. That's what we mean. Which represents either a well-functioning market or a well-regulated entity. I did also, there's no real great place to put this, but I did want to stress, there's a reason why we're projecting multiple futures, which is that the future is highly uncertain. So we really highly encourage people to draw from multiple projections when you can, but also to just generally have humility when you're working with future projections of a complicated system like the US electric grid. Not only is it difficult to fully represent such a complicated system that involves both complicated technical as well as human components and decision making in it. But these scenarios are also not exhaustive. They don't cover the full bounds of what could happen. There could be a breakout novel technology that really upends the projection that we don't see coming. As well as many other different caveats. So in general, Cambium is a best effort projection of the future of the electric grid, but we encourage humility whenever you're working with these types of future projections. We have a discussion in the report about kind of the main caveats, trying to help people better understand and interpret how to use this data. We really encourage you to go look at that. There's a lot of caveats, both to the modeling as well as just what can you do, how to think about uncertainty when you're looking out into the future, especially this far. So, okay, moving forward. I've mentioned many times now that it's a data set with many different types of metrics. So I want to just kind of give you a taste of what the metrics are that are available in the Cambium data set. So these are all things that you can go and download and get this data and work with it and plug it into your own analyses. I'm not going to go into each one of these. I've broken them into 3 different categories here. The top green box are operational metrics, is just the general category that I call this green. So things about generation capacity, things describing renewable portfolio standards at the state level, different metrics for load, demand on the electric grid, transmission, operations, just descriptions of things like loss rates and whatnot. So a bunch of different metrics there. In the green category, there's also marginal costs, hourly marginal costs, energy capacity and portfolio costs, and then various types of metrics describing the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of the electric grid. Some of the most popular metrics are in the operational, the hourly generation by technology and the nameplate capacity by technology. So how much of each technology is being built. And then what is the actual hourly generation mixture that is meeting demand in these future projections. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but the hourly thing is key. I showed you earlier just like annual summaries of the generation mixture, but we are actually delivering hourly solutions for these future grids. So if you want to go and see how in these very different futures, how demand is being met from these mixtures of technologies, you can go and download the data and take a look at that. Other popular metrics are the costs. So this is the marginal energy capacity portfolio costs. This stuff is generally useful if you are trying to do things like benefit cost analysis, or if you're screening the value of different technologies. These are the types of things that people draw from. And then probably the most popular category that people draw from for Cambium is the greenhouse gas emissions metrics. We have a handful of different ones. We have both attributional, that's average type metrics, as well as consequential, that's marginal type metrics. That's both short run and long run marginal emission rates. I'm not going to talk too much about the definitions of those. I would just generally say that if you are trying to understand the greenhouse gas intensity of the US electric grid, we have a handful of different metrics depending on what question you're trying to ask. There's different metrics that are suitable for helping to understand whatever it is you're trying to interrogate. If you're looking at these and you're not familiar with these terms, I highly encourage you to look at the report that we put out or some of the supplemental products that I'm going to be talking about later to talk a little bit about what these different metrics are, what ones are suitable for different types of questions, because it's not always totally obvious, but they are, the differences here are important. Anyway, so greenhouse gas emissions metrics are a popular part of the Cambium data sets. I'm going to talk a little bit about the temporal resolution of the data sets. I stressed a little bit on the previous slide that there is hourly data, so just want to dwell on that for a little bit more. So hourly, so you can go and you can download, I was talking about hourly generation, but there's also hourly data available for other metrics. So like this is a plot at 8760, so it's data for a full year for the long run marginal emission rate. So you can see here that that there are meaningful diurnal as well as seasonal trends that you can go and understand and download data and incorporate that into your analysis. Often people do not have hourly data to match with hourly data, so it might be cumbersome for them to work with the hourly data. So we also provide this same data but aggregated to other resolutions. A popular one is take those 8760 and then aggregate it to month hours. So I don't, if you can't read this, it's like the first hour in January. So it's the same data, but it's just aggregated. So that's a little bit easier to work with, especially if you can't match our weather assumptions. It might be better to work with the month hour data. That the month hour is probably actually more popular than the hourly data for many applications. But then we also have, we provide aggregations where we take it a step further and we just aggregate to a 24-hour vector. So it's the time of day. So if you don't have seasonal information, but you still care about the diurnal trends, we have data that you can download that we've aggregated that for you. And then lastly, we do provide annual aggregations. All the same data. This is just the weighted sum on an annual basis of whatever metric you're looking at. So obviously, if you don't have time resolved, demand data or something that you would need to multiply against ours, or you just don't care about the diurnal seasonal trends, then we do provide that annual data. It's helpful for kind of better understanding the trends across time. So that's all there, depending on what analysis you're conducting. You may be interested in different temporal resolutions that are available for download. There's also several different geographic resolutions available. On the left here, I'm showing there's this map that has 134 different regions that we've broken up the contiguous United States into, trying to capture both administrative as well as resource trends, so like the varying qualities of wind and solar resources and things like that. We've broken up the country into 134 different regions. My apologies to people in Alaska, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, etc. We only have data for the contiguous United States. That's just the READS model only has that in it. So we only have data for that. So it is actually the full US, my apologies. Anyway, so the 134 different regions on the left, you can go and download that data. Often that is more resolved than is either necessary or even sometimes appropriate. Decisions about the electric grid are often made at a larger scale than these regions. You can download it if you want it, and it's helpful for some purposes, but in many instances, this plot on the right is showing a geographic resolution that is often more appropriate for analysis as well as more tractable. It aggregates the US into these 18 different regions that are generally the regions that are helpful for, there's no perfect region, but these are generally good regions for thinking about how the grid is planned and operated. So often the geographic resolution on the right is what people end up using. And then we also have, I don't show it, but we report the data for the country as a whole. So different geographic resolutions available. Depending on what you're trying to do, you may want to download different ones. Okay, examples. I want to talk a little bit about examples of how the Cambium data is being used. I have three different categories here. The first one is that the Cambium data is used in research. It's a bunch of metrics that are designed to support other people's analyses. So that goes a lot to academic or nonprofit research, that sort of thing. You can actually get a good sense. This is just a snapshot of, if you go to the Cambium documentation and then look at who's citing it, you can get a good idea of how it's being used. So this is the stuff that I've been referencing this whole time. You can see that it's being cited by studies that are looking at building life cycle assessments, heat pumps, demand response, flexible geothermal, hydrogen production. It's stuff like this. So you're again trying to understand these technologies, either demand or supply side, electric sector technologies, and you can use this data to help support some type of research that's trying to characterize the impact of these technologies on the electric grid. It's not only research. There's also a handful of different like standard setting bodies that have adopted the Cambium data. Probably the most prominent ones are ASHRAE 189.1 and ResNet 301 have both adopted the longer marginal emission rates within their data sets. So they actually use, this is where we have hourly data, but they, for a variety of reasons, are using the month hourly aggregations of the longer marginal emission rates at these 18 different region resolution. That's the data that they've adopted, and they're making that available. Both of these are end use demand type standards. So it's trying to understand the induced emissions from buildings or other end use products. In different sectors. So those are some high-profile ways that people have downloaded our data and incorporated that into other types of decision making. And then the third category, a really broad category, is things that don't necessarily end up in publications. I just called it here internal decision making. So things where state and local governments are looking at the projections just to gain a narrative understanding of what our model says might be in the future for the U.S. electric grid. Academic institutions, utility regulators, nonprofit organizations, as well as the consulting and commercial sector. All these entities are drawing from the data in various instances, and then using it to kind of plug into some type of internal process that doesn't necessarily result in a publication, but might help inform rank ordering of different impacts that they're looking at, or things like that. Just as one example, we do have an ongoing project with Amazon where we are helping them to develop and elaborate on the methods that corporate or buyer entities might use to better understand the impacts of their actions, both things that induce emissions, like siting data centers, things like that, as well as potentially avoiding emissions, things like energy efficiency measures or deploying clean energy. So there's a lot of different ways that people use the data that don't end up in academia or standards or things like that. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to access the data. There are several different ways. So first one, there's an online viewer, scenarioviewer.nrel.gov. If you go there, the scenario viewer it doesn't only have the Cambium data on it. There's like a list of other projects. So you'd first go and select the Cambium project if that's what you're interested in, and then you would be brought to this this viewer that you can go and select different metrics and just kind of quickly through the browser examine what are in these different projections. That's useful for getting a kind of quickly understanding what's in the data. However, if you're going to be using the data for kind of your own purpose, you're probably going to have to download it. So that's where through the scenario viewer, there is a tab, download tab, and you click that, and you can go and download CSVs that have the data. And this is what people, if you're incorporating this into your own analysis, you're probably going to end up having to do the CSV download. So those are both available through this scenario viewer, which I think a link has been dropped into the chat. There's also, each year we put out the documentation. This describes the scenarios, it describes the methods that we're using to calculate the metrics, and defines the metrics. So like if you're looking at the CSVs, there's these kind of, maybe they make sense, maybe they don't, the names of the columns. If it's, you know, not clear, you should double check anyway. When you're working with the data, you can go and look at the report, and search in the report for the metric, the column, and just make sure that it is what you think it is. So there's the annually updated documentation and metrics description. And then the last thing is, like I said, the greenhouse gas emissions metrics are probably our most popular metric. So because of that, we do have a Excel workbook that we use, that we put together and then update and put out annually with the rest of the data, that just helps. It's a little bit easier to work with than the CSVs for this specific metric, the long run marginal emission rates. So if you're interested in long run marginal emission rates, you can download this emissions workbook. There's a link to it on the viewer, and if you just Google Cambium, there'll be links to where this workbook is, and I think it might be also dropped into the chat. So again, it's only workbooks for this single metric, the long run marginal emission rate. If you care about other things, you got to go and download the data. But if you do care about this metric, I encourage you checking out these workbooks. They're a little bit easier to work with. So that's it. That's the content I've got. So I believe that Emily was going to, there's questions coming in, and I'm going to spend some time answering those.
Yes, thank you, Peter. So I did drop the links to the Cambium webpage, as well as the scenario viewer and the documentation and the workbooks in the chat. Just a reminder to type any questions you have in the Q&A box. I see a few people have raised their hands. Your mics are disabled, so just go ahead and type any questions in the chat. We already have several in there that we will start to go through right now. So first question for you, Peter, is can you please explain short run and long run marginal emission rates?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. This is an area of particular interest for me. So the concept of a marginal emission rate is basically saying what is, if you either increase or decrease the demand on the electric grid, what is the induced or avoided emission rate from that kind of perturbation from the margin. So this is, marginal emission rates tend to be the things that we point to for trying to understand what is the impact of a decision. So it's not describing the state of the world, it's saying if you take a particular action, if you have a particular intervention, these are the metrics that are designed to help estimate the consequences of that intervention. So that's what marginal emission rates are. The short run and long run that's a technical term, short run and long run. Short run means that it's working with a fixed set of capital assets. So just saying what is the kind of this marginal generation mixture, not taking into account how the thing that you're doing might influence the capital assets of the grid. It mostly means generators and to a lesser extent transmission lines. Whereas the long run marginal emission rate means that it's answering that question, what is the result of your action, including the possibility for your action to influence the capital assets on the electric grid. That might sound really wonky. It's super important. If the basic idea is, let's say you are interested in understanding the consequences of electrifying the municipal vehicle fleet of Denver. And you want to understand the emissions consequences of that. If you want to understand the consequences of that, you would ideally strive to capture the impacts of that action as comprehensively as possible, which includes not only how the electric vehicles would influence the operation of the grid, but also how it might influence what gets built. So if you electrify the vehicle fleet here in Denver, there might be more wind, solar, and gas that is built in response to that new electrical load. And therefore you would want to reflect that in your estimation. So for many instances, if you're trying to understand the consequences of an action, a long-run marginal emission rate is a more comprehensive description of the consequences of that action. That's why we made the workbooks and why most people use it. The short-run marginal emission rate has purposes. It's more of describing kind of the immediate operational impact of an intervention prior to any structural effects being felt. Or in instances where you wouldn't necessarily expect structural responses to a particular intervention. So if you've only heard prior to this someone say marginal emission rates, they're probably talking about short-run marginal emission rates. If this is a concept unfamiliar to you, but you work in this space, I encourage you to read into it a little bit more. This distinction is important. I could keep talking, but I'm not going to.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. All right, the next one we have is, how can we find data of transmission, import, and export? I can't find these metrics in the scenario viewer.
There should be, so I guess, first of all, my apologies, we do not have like the amount of, we don't say like what is the trading between regions. So if you're just interested in looking, how much is CAISO importing from specifically Oregon or something like that, we don't have that specific type of data. It'd be nice. We didn't make the cut when we're putting together the data, and we haven't gotten around to elaborating the data set in that way. There should be a column that says what is the total amount of imports or exports for regions. You can go and look and say, CAISO, what is the total amount of imports into that region? So it's not specifically to and from regions, but saying what is the imports or exports from regions. That should be in the data set. If it's not, someone should send me a note, but it should be there.
All right, thank you. Let's go to this one. Can you please provide some basic guidance on when someone would want to use the Cambium datasets versus the standard scenario datasets?
Sure. So the standard scenario, Cambium draws heavily from the standard scenarios. Standard scenarios has a broader set of scenarios. So Cambium has 8 different scenarios projected out in the future. The standard scenarios has, depending on the year, somewhere between 50 or 70. So there's more scenarios. However, there is much less data, and it's only resolved at the annual level. So there's not any of this stuff about hourly data of any type in the standard scenarios. It's just high-level descriptions. What I tend to say to people is the standard scenarios is mostly meant as a narrative product. You go to the standard scenarios to primarily understand kind of the range of possible, have a narrative understanding of the possible future of the US electric grid. There are, and you can go and download the annual generation and capacity mixtures of those different future scenarios, which you can plug into different analyses, but there aren't things like the marginal emission rates or costs or these types of things that are really more of meant to support other analyses. So standard scenario is best for just kind of gaining a intuition and understanding of where we might go. Cambium is really, if you're looking for data to plug into your own analysis, you're probably going to be interested in the Cambium data set because it has both more metrics as well as higher resolution.
All right, thank you. Next one, can you talk about what are the key updates that you're planning for Cambium?
Yeah, so our main objective, of course, is just to stay on top of all of the different evolving trends. So policy landscape, especially at the state level, is constantly changing, as well as just the evolution of the technology landscape, updating our projections for the cost and performance of different technologies. It's particularly important for better understanding kind of the potential role of nascent technologies. So things like hydrogen or CCS, carbon capture and storage technologies. There's a lot of uncertainty there, so we spend a lot of time trying to understand what are the possible, the ranges of possible performance and costs of those technologies. How do they fit into the landscape, and plugging into them, the model, things like that is often what we spend focusing on. There's also a bunch of stuff that I don't think is particularly interesting unless you're doing research in this space. Things like there are improvements that we are trying to make to the long-run marginal emission rate to better reflect the kind of intertemporal phenomenon that when I show like the 8760s and things like that, it's how does your action in 1 hour influence what's happening in another hour. That stuff is really complicated. There's room for improvement there. So there's these kind of underlying methodological things that we're working on that I think there's maybe a dozen people in the world that really care about, but is an ongoing opportunity to improve the data set. So I'll stop there.
Sounds good. And somebody asked, how should we cite the usage of the data set when using it for private consulting services? And are there any limitations to the usage for private use?
Oh, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to have this be my understanding. But you should there's some language. If you go to the scenario viewer, there is a disclaimer that has some language around usage. My understanding as a layperson that you should not take as legal advice is that you should reference that you're using our data when you use it, but that there isn't a limitation. You can incorporate this data into your workflow as a consultant and deliver results based off of it, and that there aren't any restrictions on the use of it. But you should look at the actual legal language, and if there's something really that it's a use case that seems ambiguous, then reach out, and I guess I'll send you to the legal team, and they can tell you.
All right, thank you. This next question is, will the Cambium data start going beyond 2050 soon, or are projections beyond that so unstable that we shouldn't bother? ASHRAE 240p has suggested we should hold the 2050 value fixed for the remaining years in the reference study period, 60-year default beyond Cambium's 2050 values. So there's no decarbonization after that date.
Yeah. So I'd actually say that it's first, to answer your question, we are talking about potentially pushing back the date and making it go to 2060 or something like that. We're not going to do that this year, but we'll probably do it at some point. I don't know when we'd make that switch. I would actually say that there was something about instability in the future. And I would actually say that one of the reasons why we don't project out further now is actually, I would say, the opposite, in the sense that the grid has kind of equilibrated at a particular condition, and then the model just kind of looks the same after that if you project it out. There's small details that matter. I don't mean to be blasé, especially yeah, it depends on specifically what metric you're looking at. There can be material changes, but for the most part, by the time you get out to 2050, our model has kind of it's fairly steady at that point. So there's not too much more information you get from projecting further out. And one of the main reasons why it's steady is because our projections of the cost of technology, performance, and fuel and all that stuff is also steady at that point, because we don't know anything about the difference between 2050 and 2060. So therefore, you're at this equilibrium condition. We don't know anything about there, so it just kind of goes forward like that in time. So I think it is very reasonable to just hold the projections at the end of our 2050 steady, just because we don't really know that much more beyond that point. Again, I'm speaking, there are specific questions that what I'm saying would not be appropriate answers to, but from a high level, that's the response I'm given.
All right, thanks, Peter. Next question, is the data accessible through an API like PV Watts?
Yeah. So there is an API. We don't really advertise it because there is, we haven't, to be perfectly frank, we're not guaranteed that it's going to stay in its current form, and we don't want a bunch of people going and building stuff based off of it when we go and maybe update the kind of infrastructure of the database that might change the API. So there is probably a point at which we'll advertise the API as being a stable interface more to the public at a future point. However, with that being said, if you hear my caveat, you're interested in the API and you're aware of the fact that you may have to adapt to some changes in the coming years as we, if we update the infrastructure, if you're comfortable with that, send me a note and I can connect you with the folks that can tell you the how to access the API. It does exist. It's just it's not fully stable yet.
All right. Next question, does Cambium provide information about coincident peak demand in different regions of the US and the corresponding coincident peak value stack?
So coincident peak demand, so that means a technical thing to me that I'm not sure is the same thing that you're thinking about, questioner. I will say that there is hourly, demand data, so you can go and look at our you can go and look and identify the time periods, the specific single hour that has the maximum demand, or the top 100 hours, and then look at what technologies are serving the demand during that time. So if that's what you're asking, yes, there is that data available. There's things, coincident demand means certain things for retail electricity rates, and we would not have, that there's certain things that you might mean that we don't have data on, but we do have, you can go and look at what the most stressful periods are for the grid and understand how the grid's demands are being served during that time, if that's what you mean.
All right, next question. How does the firm capacity asset build out and generation projections differ across the mid case and the other perturbation runs?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, so the business as usual style set, those 6 sets. I guess first of all, if you're interested in firm capacity and the contribution of different technologies, I highly encourage you to go and look at the standard scenarios report. We have some pretty good figures there that across that kind of full 50 or 60 scenario suite, we show different contributions of different technologies to capacity. That is, if you're interested in the firm capacity, that is a better product than the standard scenarios. But you're asking how does it vary across the scenarios? I would say, again, the very high level summary for the business as usual style 6 scenarios in Cambium, the high level doesn't vary too much. Natural gas plays a huge role. The energy contribution in some scenarios of natural gas goes down because wind and solar is really cheap on an energy basis, but in no scenarios do we project a decrease in natural gas capacity. The generators are just being used less, but we're actually building more of them. And in fact, even in the decarbonization scenarios, natural gas still plays a very significant role in our projections. It's net decarbonization, so even if you have 100% net decarbonization, model still heavily relies on natural gas and then offsets it with it uses it very little, but it uses it as a peaking resource and then offsets the emissions from that through negative emissions technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture. So high level, the natural gas plays a significant role. Nukes and hydro continue to play a role. They don't really expand much, but they play a material and important role in firm capacity. And then wind and solar both contribute, but certainly their firm capacity contribution is materially less on a per capacity basis than other technologies, just because they kind of cannibalize their own contribution. So we have more information about that in the standard scenarios report if you care about those sorts of things.
Thanks, Peter. Next question. Can you explain how users might apply Cambium's emission projections when comparing to Energy Star's eGrid current emissions? Cambium 2022 regions reflected regions that more closely matched the eGrid regions than Cambium 2023. Is it still valid to use Cambium 2023 to forecast a reduction from a baseline eGrid emission rate, even though the regions don't closely match?
Yes, yeah, so good question. So as this questioner is asking, in our 2022 release, we attempted to replicate the eGrid regions, if you're familiar with them. This was, in retrospect, a mistake because we cannot exactly replicate them. Our regions, those 134 different regions, don't exactly map to eGrid regions. So we had things that were an attempt to replicate, but sometimes there would be important differences, like a nuclear plant might be in one region of an eGrid data and in a different region for us. Which meant that there were people were interpreting them as not just best effort replications of the eGrid regions, but actually quite close. And they weren't actually as close as people were understanding. So we changed that. We probably shouldn't have done it initially because our ability to replicate eGrid was never perfect. Even though we did try during 2022. So we changed the regions to these, we call them GIA regions. That's not a particularly clever name. Those 18 regions that I showed during the presentation. They are very similar to eGrid regions. Like if you go and look at the eGrid map and then look at our map, they're quite similar. They're trying to capture a similar, whatever, important features of the US electric grid, but they're not identical. You in general should not you shouldn't use an eGrid data point from one of their regions and then kind of compare it to a projected point from a similar region in ours, or if you do, there's a discontinuity there. All that's to say is the advice that I have for you is that if you go to the scenario viewer, there are data sets that you can download where we have gone and taken the plant level, the generator level eGrid data and aggregated it up to the regions that we are providing. And then you can, if your interest is to put the greenhouse gas emissions intensity in a historical context, or you want to use like the historical observed data as a starting point, we do have that available for our regions. So if you're able to use eGrid data for our regions, where we've taken plant level eGrid data and then aggregated it to our GIA regions, that data is available through the scenario viewer. It's like called the GIA regions data or something like that, that file. If you are trying to find it and you can't find it, send me a note. So there is that. If you're stuck using eGrid regions and eGrid data and you want to compare it to ours, there's no perfect way. Sorry, there's just going to be a discontinuity because of the differences between our model structure and the way that eGrid reports their data.
All right, and this is a very related question that you might have covered most of, but could you talk about how the definitions of the Cambium GEA regions has changed from 2022 to 23? Also, is there an overlap with the 18 regions defined in 2023 and other geographic makeups such as electricity market module regions, EMMS?
Yeah, right. So the question of how they've changed is what I just said, is that the 2022 release had very similar regions, but not identical, because we were attempting to replicate eGrid, but then it just was apparent about the way that people were engaging with the data that was an error in judgment. So we changed in 2023 to these new regions that are similar, but are meant to be more obviously distinct from the eGrid regions, and we will retain these going forward, barring I guess if there's some major administrative change of two regions, we might move one thing to another if it really becomes important. But we're not planning on changing the GIA regions year over year or anything like that. So that's the story behind why those regions changed. Apologies for anyone whose workflow was disrupted by that, but there was a reason for it. What was the other? Was there, Emily? I can't remember if there was.
Yeah, the second part is there an overlap with the 18 regions defined in the 23 and other geographic makeups, such as electricity market module regions?
Right, so we're all striving for the same thing. So the electricity market module regions, that's a NEMS thing, I think, for the EIA. We are all striving to kind of aggregate the nation into meaningful regions, meaningful and tractable regions. So if you look at the electricity market module regions and then look at our regions, they're going to be broadly similar, but the details matter. The boundaries are not identical. We're not trying to replicate them, but we're all kind of motivated by the same thing. I think the EMMs are bigger than our regions. I don't really know. I don't know off the top of my head all the different differences. This is a perennial difficulty, right? Is everyone has slightly different regions, so it makes it hard to compare data sets. It's just it's kind of an obstacle in the fact that our model is not infinitely resolved, so we can only aggregate in certain ways.
All right, thank you. And we have several more in here, so we'll try to make it through as many as we can. And if we don't make it to your question, Peter can follow up via email afterwards. But the next one in here is, do the electric demand projections differ across the different Cambium scenarios? And are they coming from the Reeds model? If so, what is the source of this data set on a high level, and how are they projected?
Yes, so in the Cambium sets, the 8 different scenarios that we have projected, 7 of them have identical end-use demand. One of them, the high demand scenario, has a different end-use demand that is materially higher. So for the most part, the end-use demand is constant across the scenarios. I say end-use because the total amount of demand includes things like battery charging and things like that, which will differ across scenarios. But the amount of assumptions about electrification and things like that are constant across the scenarios we have. If you go to the standard scenarios, there's an additional couple of perturbations. There's a low demand scenario, as well as things like one that imposes significant demand growth from hydrogen production through electrolysis. So there's a handful more different growth demand scenarios in the standard scenarios, but Cambium only has the 2, and most of them share just a common set of assumptions. We used to do that in-house. We ended up more recently purchasing demand projections from an outside analysis group, Evolved Energy Research. I am not actually intimately familiar with the model that they use, but my understanding is it's they have a stock rollover and kind of a bottom-up estimate of demand projections that then they tune based off of historical conditions, something like that. You could tell from my language that I'm exposing my ignorance here. Other people on our team know a lot more about that. If there's a link to the report that Evolved Energy Research put out that you can read through if you really care about kind of what is underlying our end use projections. It's linked to in the standard scenarios appendix and the Cambium report. If you're having trouble finding that, email me.
All right. Next question. Is this data appropriate to reference for greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the stationary energy sector? If not, is there a data set that is?
Yeah, so for the most part, no. So greenhouse gas inventory reporting, I'm thinking of like if you're doing corporate reporting, following the rules of the greenhouse gas protocol or something like that, you should really draw from that stuff. It tends to be retrospective reporting if you're doing an inventory, and you should draw from empirical data statements from the electric grid operators. Cambium is not built for facilitating retrospective reporting. It's a projection of the future, not a description of what has happened in the past. So if I understood correctly what you're asking for, we are not, the Cambium data product is not intended to be used, and I would say not appropriate to be used for inventory reporting purposes. I would say that you could, if you're interested in trying to understand where your scope 2 reporting might go in the future, you could use our projections to help understand what might happen to your scope 2 emissions. But that's not, you shouldn't use it for reporting. That's just an internal analysis, like, are we going to meet our goals based off of the potential evolution of the electric grid over the coming decades, that sort of thing. I will say also is that you said inventory. There are other things that you can use for like the greenhouse gas protocol, like the project level guidance that does say you can use marginal emission rates. So you could. I'm not going to say whether or not it's appropriate, but you could, if you are trying to do not an inventory, but like a project impact estimate. The Cambium data is meant for that. Whether or not it's appropriate depends on specifically what is being used. It should not be used for estimating, for like making claims about the impact of renewable energy deployment or stuff like that. Claims, anytime you get lawyers involved, capacity expansion models are really probably not the right tool. There's just too much uncertainty, and claims really should be based off of empirical data, not projections for the most part. I'm speaking broadly here.
All right, thanks, Peter. You made it through a lot of questions in the chat. We still have some that are unanswered that I will send to Peter so he can reach out afterwards. I left a lot of kind of the more detailed or specific case questions, so he'll touch base with you one-on-one. And if you want to go to the next slide for me, Peter, I'll wrap up in the next couple minutes here by sharing some exciting news that we actually haven't shared publicly yet, which is that this webinar series will be continuing. We're going to have 6 more Powered By webinars in the next 6 months, same time, the second Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. The first one is going to be the Probabilistic Resource Adequacy Suite, which is an open source research-oriented collection of tools for analyzing resource adequacy of bulk power systems. And that's going to be presented by Gord Stephen. We don't actually have a registration available quite yet. We're still in the process of launching the registration pages for the next set of webinars. But I am going to drop in the chat our email list so that you will be the first to know once that's available. So go ahead and subscribe to that. And we'll let you know as soon as it's ready. And a reminder that we'll be posting the recording to this webinar on our Powered By page, as well as sending it out to all who registered via email in the next week or so. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye.